Welcome! This is the final video in the INFO2 section that deals with biases. If you have not watched the two short videos, Intro to Biases and Types of Biases, please do so now. My name is Jorge Leon, and most likely I engaged with most of you during our first Info1 class discussing misinformation, satire, and fake news. The combined point of these two sessions is to assist students in understanding barriers that hinder our ability to evaluate sources and information freely. The first two videos dealt with types of biases. This section is going to dive a little deeper, define a few other types, and talk about some of our strategies. A quick note, this class will deal with biases. This is not a discussion about prejudice. Oftentimes we hear both terms linked together like they are the same. One causes the other behavior. We're just going to deal with biases, which are personal, some are conscious, and some are unconscious. It is important to note that everybody has them, and they can be very deeply rooted and hard for many people to articulate or express. Now, the earlier video talked about introduction to some of these concepts. We're just going to take a little bit of a longer and deeper dive, then talk about some of the strategies. So don't worry about the fact that there's a lot of terms on here. Just like in our first conversation during the misinformation class, the term bias is a very broad umbrella term with a large number of subcategories beneath it. We're only going to be looking at a handful of these. If you want to come back and explore further, please come back or check the sources so you can follow up with more information about their definitions and the context. We're going to start with a term that you should have already have heard a couple of times, confirmation bias. So we're not going to dive too deep into the definition. The important thing to know about it is that it is a tendency to filter information or accept new information that is consistent with one's existing beliefs. Now, for this example, we're going to talk about an imaginary researcher, Anne. She believes that eating sushi is something unhealthy and that only certain kinds of people could eat raw fish. Probably not that far-fetched of an example, right? Many of us know some picky eaters. So, if our imaginary student, Anne, was to run into an article from the National Post with such a clickbait title that read "Fake Fish," study finds nearly half of sushi served at restaurants is mislabeled. Personally, what do we think that student would respond? How do we respond to something like that? Let's talk about some of the strategies about this one. At a first glance, the title definitely sounds like it's a bit of clickbait, and there are some red flags with this one. They should give us pause and make us read further into beyond the headline. So let's explore a couple of different things. While the title does sound like it is clickbait, the article does clarify the intent pretty short after the introduction by giving it a subtitle and an introduction that clearly says where it's coming from, so we can maybe give it a pass. Secondly, we can tell that this is not original reporting. This National Post article is reporting on a Times article. That means we should pull up the original article. So when we do that, we're able to confirm some of those red flags we had earlier. First, talking about the clickbait title, we're able to see that the original article's title was a bit more muted. They didn't have such large language like saying that fake fish. And it is very specific about location, just saying LA restaurants. So we can confirm the first article was a bit more misleading. Next, we can see how much new information was added. So how much new journalism did the National Post ad, or was it pretty much just copy and post? As a side note, the question here to ask is, would our researcher Anne would have reacted as strongly to this title that the Times article had? In general, it is a good practice for us to always look up several articles confirming the same story, compare their headlines, see which one is being a bit over dramatic or which one is adding language that makes us emotionally respond, so we can confirm the raw details and not all of the other fluff that they're adding in to get us to respond, to click, to share. On our next example, we're going to talk a little bit about anchoring effect. And the anchoring effect is sort of that situation when you rely too heavily on the initial piece of information that you found on a topic right before you're making decisions. Examples of this can be pretty basic and pretty broad, like when you go to purchase something and you saw an ad for a TV, and you've always seen that a base price for it should be this much. Then you see one being much, much cheaper. You may end up disregarding that much cheaper one because of your previous anchoring to ads that the value is supposed to be higher. Essentially, it could lead you to overpaying because your perception of it is skewed or tilted. Take a moment and think about that. Are there things that, other than in purchases, that you would have maybe in political decisions, life decisions, or more, where you may have not had enough information and have relied very heavily on just your first bit of information? So what are some of our strategies for dealing with an anchoring effect? They're pretty similar to some of the other things we've done before, or even some of the things we saw in the misinformation class. We should always look to find multiple sources, maybe finding opposing viewpoints like a research database, or even looking at a type of news source that gives us multiple types of headlines and perspectives. They really are very good at helping us fill in blind spots. In very extreme cases, anchoring effect is one of those things that can explain why it may be very difficult at times to convince somebody of information that is contrary to their pre-existing beliefs. Let's move on. Here's where it starts to get a little bit tricky. Apophenia describes the tendency to see patterns or create meaning in places where there may not be any meaning or things are unrelated. Some of the more harmless examples can include when people see faces in the clouds, or they're seeing patterns in the night sky. These are some of the less harmless, benign examples. Some of the severe negative ones can include when people see unconnected pieces of data or unconnected stories as proof of large conspiracies. In the misinformation class, we briefly talked about conspiracies. This is the other part of that big picture. This explains sometimes those behaviors or phenomenons. Apophenia or misperceiving correlations can attribute sometimes the mental leaps that are necessary to believe in the pieces that make those conspiracies possible. One example that often we go back to is the conspiracy about the moon landing. It is often talked about. There's a number of conspiratory evidence that shows that either the flag wasn't waving or the shadows weren't pointing in the right direction. If you're interested in learning more about some of these and some of the proof that there is to disprove these conspiracies, recently a project by MIT called In the Event of the Moon Disaster took a look at collectively seeing everything from creating a deep fake about what happens if the astronauts never were able to take back off, to putting together data, to encouraging digital literacy. I'm going to put the link up. Visit it if you have a chance. It's a fantastic art installation and educational piece that they've put together. Now, what about strategies? These should be familiar to you by now. Some of the most important ones are to be very careful of stories that very weakly link together through 2 or 3 facts as proof for a conspiracy. Often they're very weak claims with very little information to back them up. Obviously, same thing we've talked about before, using multiple fact-checking sites to be able to check in on a story that just seems too good or too true to be factual. Everything from using Snopes or All Sides, Pointer, or PolitiFact. These are all fact-checking sites that dedicate their resources to debunking and to putting just factual content out for people to use. And I can't say this enough. Avoid sharing stories that you can't confirm or that you don't know if they're true or not. Helping break the cycle of sharing these conspiratorial stories is one of the most important things we can do as a group. The last piece to this, which goes together with apophenia, is often a conversation that you might hear about. Does correlation equal causation? Just because 2 graphs line up doesn't mean that one causes the other. So you may or may not have heard that as a phrase. Correlation does not equal causation. I've added a disclaimer there, does not necessarily equal causation, because sometimes it does. The short version is that when 2 things are related, but one does not cause the other, then it is a correlation, not a causation. Sometimes 2 things are related by a third factor. For example, in a pretty famous education video, it discusses about how ice cream and forest fires are correlated. This is the graph in the top left. It's not to say that one thing causes the other. It is just simply that there is a third factor related. In this specific case, both ice cream consumption and forest fires go up during hot months of the year. They're correlated. Currently, there are complete websites dedicated to finding nonsensical correlations, like the example here about potato chip costs. The important thing to understand is that they're part of a built-in process for us to interpret data. Sometimes people see graphs like this and they tend to believe that there's a trend. You have to be careful with them and be curious. Always dig deeper. Many times things like these are a reason for people to cry out that there is a deeper conspiracy, that there is something deeper going on, where it's just important for us to look at it objectively and understand what's going on behind it. My plea for most of you guys with wrapping up this video is to just be informed consumers and not just see a trend and go, oh, those obviously have something to do with each other. Please take the time to look through the resources. Wish you the best, and I hope that you continue discovering and learning. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.